My name is Margaret Hill, and I'm 67 years old. Can you imagine waking up under a bright fluorescent light, barely able to move, with your throat dry and your thoughts foggy, only to realize that your own son may have drugged you, dressed your body, and brought you to an insurance office to prove you were dead just so he could collect $500,000 and drive off into a new life? I didn't want to believe it either. But sometimes the people you raise with both hands, feed, shelter, forgive, and love more than life itself, grow into strangers who look you in the eye and smile while sharpening the knife behind your back. It started after my hip surgery. The doctors called it routine, and I suppose to them it was. But to me it felt like stepping into a fog that never fully cleared. One day, I was moving slower than usual, and the next, I was lying in a hospital bed, surrounded by machines and quiet footsteps, needing help to sit up and brush my hair. I was grateful that Evan, my son, my only child, took charge of everything. He brought me a soft blanket from home, spoke kindly to the nurses, promised to handle all the insurance and bank matters so I could rest. He told me I didn't need to think about a single thing, and I believed him. Of course, I believed him. After a few days, I was transferred to a quiet recovery facility just outside the city. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and peaceful. I had a small room with a view of a garden, a call button near my bed, and nurses who remembered my name. My days blurred together in a gentle rhythm. Tea, oatmeal, pain pills, naps. The kind of days where you stop checking the clock and start trusting the routine. And maybe that's why I didn't question anything until that one night. It was after dinner. A nurse brought in my usual evening medication. Nothing new, she said, and I swallowed it the way I always did. But almost immediately, I felt something strange, something cold spreading through my chest, like a fog sliding under my skin. My limbs got heavy too fast. My thoughts slowed down until they weren't thoughts anymore, and the edges of the room started to fade. I remember Evan sitting beside me. I remember his hand on mine. His voice was soft, almost too soft. He said, "It's okay now, Mom. You can rest." And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. Maybe a few hours, maybe longer. But when I came to, just briefly, I swear I saw bright overhead lights, not the warm yellow kind in my recovery room, but the kind you see in hospital morgues or offices, cold, sterile, and buzzing. I couldn't lift my head. I couldn't speak. I felt a tug at my wrist. I thought I saw someone holding a clipboard. Then everything faded again. I told myself later it must have been a dream, that the medication hit me harder that night, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, something in me whispered that it wasn't a dream, that someone wanted me gone, not just out of the way, but erased. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there with my phone in my lap, staring at that text like it had come from some distant, cruel stranger, like it couldn't possibly be Evan. Not my Evan. I kept thinking maybe it was a mistake, maybe someone else had sent it, maybe he was being blackmailed or set up, but the truth settled in my chest like wet cement, heavy and inescapable, and no matter how many ways I tried to twist the facts, I couldn't escape what was right in front of me. My son faked my death. He lied to the government, the banks, the insurance company, and probably even to his wife. He told the world I was gone so he could bury me on paper and collect $500,000 while I was still lying in a hospital bed. And I realized something else, something far worse. This hadn't happened overnight. This took planning. He would have had to get a death certificate, probably forged. He would have needed documents, forms, signatures. He knew my social security number. He knew where I kept everything. He probably logged into my accounts, changed my passwords, rerouted my mail, called in claims pretending to be me or a grieving family member. The boy who used to fall asleep with his hand wrapped around my thumb had now erased me from the world. I picked up the phone again and called the bank. I tried 3 different numbers. One finally let me through to a human being, a young man with a robotic tone who asked for my name, account number, and date of birth. I gave it all. There was a pause. Then he said, "Ma'am, this account is listed as closed due to the account holder's death." I told him I was alive. I told him I was Margaret Hill and that I was very much not dead. I asked to speak to a manager. The young man hesitated, then transferred me, and I waited on hold for what felt like hours, the elevator music poking at my nerves, until a woman with a tight voice finally answered. and asked the same questions again. She didn't believe me at first, but I offered to FaceTime. I said I'd send ID, hospital records, anything. After another long pause, she said, "We'll need to escalate this to our legal department, Mrs. Hill. Please understand that if a fraudulent claim was made, we will investigate fully." Fraudulent, the word made me shiver, because it wasn't just paperwork. This was my life, my name, my home, my dignity, and someone, my own son, had tossed it in the garbage to make a buck. The next morning, I asked one of the nurses for help accessing my emails. I hadn't checked them in weeks, maybe months. I expected the usual junk, ads and coupons, but what I found made my stomach drop. There were messages from my electric company, my credit card provider, my insurance, and even my church newsletter. Every single one had bounced back. Mailbox not found, undeliverable. Recipient deactivated. He had shut down my email or rerouted it. I tried resetting my password, but the system said my recovery phone number had been changed. I had no way back in. It was like I was being erased, piece by piece, from every system I'd ever belonged to. And worse, no one seemed surprised. No one was stopping it. No alarm bells had gone off. Because people die every day, and most of the time, they don't come back to complain about it. I lay in bed that night and stared at the ceiling. My body ached, not from surgery, but from betrayal. I kept replaying every moment I'd ever had with Evan, his first birthday party, the day he got his license, the night he called me after his first breakup and cried into the phone like the world had ended. I was there for every second. I held his hand through chickenpox, heartbreak, unemployment. I co-signed his first apartment lease. When his wife Jenna got pregnant, I bought the crib. I never asked for anything in return. Just love, respect, a phone call once in a while. Was that too much? Apparently, it was. The worst part was knowing that he didn't just do this for the money. He planned to walk away from me entirely. There was no way to explain this as a mistake. No way to excuse a forged death certificate and rerouted accounts. This wasn't desperation. This was choice. And that choice hurt more than any betrayal I'd ever known. I needed answers. I needed proof. I needed to see with my own eyes how far this had gone. The next day, I asked the nurse to help me borrow a tablet from the rec room. It was old and slow, but it had internet. I logged onto Facebook, not my account, because I couldn't access it anymore. But I searched for Evan's name, and there he was, smiling in profile photos with Jenna and their baby girl, Claire. I tapped through his page, heart pounding. He hadn't blocked me, probably because he thought I wasn't coming back. And that's when I saw it. A new car, bright white, sleek, a photo with the caption, "Finally got my dream ride. Thanks, universe." Vacation photos, palm trees, cocktails, Jenna in a sundress and sun hat, Claire giggling in a floaty in what looked like Mexico or the Bahamas, a post about starting fresh and letting go of the past, another about being grateful for second chances. And under one photo of their dinner at an oceanfront restaurant, someone had commented, "Heard about your mom." "I'm so sorry, man," Evan had replied. "Thanks. She's in a better place now." I put the tablet down and looked out the window. The sun was setting, casting golden lines across the trees, and for the first time since that awful text, I smiled, just a little, because the man who thought he could kill me on paper, erase my name, steal my life, and ride off into the sunset with $500,000, he was about to learn the most important lesson I ever taught him. Never underestimate your mother. I used to think that when someone betrayed you, it would come crashing down like thunder, with yelling, with slamming doors, maybe with tears, or even broken glass. But when it finally happened to me, it came wrapped in silence and paperwork, tucked away in polite systems and cheerful bank menus, and it moved so quietly, I almost didn't realize it had already happened until there was nothing left of my name but a number crossed out in some hidden database. This kind of betrayal doesn't scream, it whispers. And it whispers through forms and forged signatures and the quiet clicking of a keyboard behind your back while you're too weak to get out of bed. After seeing that text from Evan, and those photos of him smiling with his wife and daughter on some sunny beach far away from here, I knew that I couldn't just sit and wonder anymore. I needed facts, something real, something that would prove what my heart already understood. because no mother ever wants to believe her own child would treat her like she was disposable. So the very next morning, I picked up my phone with hands that still trembled slightly from the leftover anesthesia and called the county clerk's office, pretending like I was just another citizen, like I wasn't shaking from the inside out as I asked them, calmly, politely, almost absurdly, for a certified copy of my own death certificate. The woman on the line sounded confused, maybe even a little amused at first, clearly thinking I must have meant someone else, or that I was calling on behalf of a deceased relative, not myself. But when I gave her my name, my full date of birth, my social security number, and told her that I was calling from a medical recovery facility, alive, her voice changed completely. There was a long silence, the kind that makes your ears buzz, and then she asked me to hold, and those few minutes stretched into something much longer than they should have been, until another voice came on the line, a different woman, older, more careful, the kind of voice that makes you sit up straighter because you can tell something's coming. She told me, in the kind of tone people use when they don't want to be held responsible for your reaction, that yes, there was indeed a death certificate on file for a Margaret Louise Hill, issued just 2 weeks ago, listing the cause of death as complications following surgery, and that it had been properly notarized and signed by a physician, one whose name I had never heard before in my life. She wouldn't read me the full contents, said she wasn't authorized to release details over the phone, but she did confirm that the next of kin listed, the person who had requested and submitted the form, was Evan Hill. It's strange how your whole body can go cold even when you're sitting in a sunlit room with a warm blanket over your legs and a gentle spring breeze rattling the window panes, because that's exactly what happened to me. My hand, still holding the phone to my ear, suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. I thanked her, somehow managing to keep my voice steady, and asked if I could receive a copy of the certificate. She said it would be mailed to the address listed on file, and when I asked what that address was, she paused and said, with careful politeness, that she wasn't permitted to share that information over the phone. But I didn't need her to tell me. I already knew where it would be going, Evan's house, my so-called final resting place. When I hung up the phone, I didn't scream or cry or collapse. I just sat very still, letting the silence of the room fill the spaces inside me that used to be held together by trust. And I realized that Evan hadn't just filed some shady insurance paperwork behind my back. He had submitted a legally binding document to the government that declared me dead, and he had done it without so much as a second thought, without a single tear, without once sitting down at my bedside to say goodbye. And it didn't stop there. I needed to know what else he had done, so I asked one of the younger nurses, sweet girl named Alicia, who always brought me ginger tea in the afternoons, if she could help me call someone. I still remembered my old neighbor Patty's number. She never liked cell phones and had kept her landline through the years, swearing it was more reliable. Patty and I used to sit on our porches and talk about everything from birds to politics to the best way to keep tomato plants upright in the wind. We hadn't spoken in months, but the moment she heard my voice, she shrieked like she'd seen a ghost, and maybe, to her, she had. She was crying before I even finished saying hello, and she told me, through sobs and gasps, that the whole neighborhood thought I had passed away. Evan had apparently held a small, private memorial service in their backyard, said it was what I had wanted. No drama, no fuss, just a simple goodbye. Patty said she'd sent flowers, baked a casserole, cried for days. When I told her I was alive and recovering, she was so stunned, she asked if this was some kind of prank. I asked her if anyone had been to my house. She paused, then said that Evan had cleaned it out just last week. He told everyone he was handling the estate, and she'd seen trucks there, boxes being loaded, furniture being taken away. Everything gone. My books, my photos, my linens, my garden tools. He told her I'd left the house to him in my will. It was in that moment, hearing her say those words, your will, that something in me snapped, not violently, but coldly, with a kind of eerie calm. Because he hadn't just stolen my money. He hadn't just erased me from a database or fooled some clerk into stamping a forged certificate. He had stripped my life down to the walls and floorboards and repurposed it for himself, like I was nothing more than a chapter that had ended, like he had read all he needed and was ready to tear the page out. He had taken the shawl my mother had crocheted by hand when I had my first child. He had taken the tin box where I kept every family recipe, stained with thyme and flour, notes scribbled in the margins from decades of Sunday dinners. He had taken the love letters from my late husband, folded and refolded so many times the paper had gone soft. He had taken the black and white photograph of me standing barefoot in my grandmother's backyard, smiling into the sunlight like the whole world was ahead of me. He took all of it, and then he got on a plane with his wife and child, smiling into cocktails while I was left here to rot. But I didn't rot. I breathed, I blinked, I lived, and I made a vow right then and there, lying in a bed that now felt like a battlefield. I would not fade. I would not let this be the end of my story. He wanted a dead mother so badly. Well, he was going to find out what happens when a ghost starts fighting back. No more trusting. No more hoping. No more silence. I was going to find every document, every transaction, every lie. I was going to peel his new life apart, one layer at a time, and show the world exactly what kind of man he was. He declared me gone, but I was still here, and I was just getting started. The day I decided to stop being a victim wasn't marked by some dramatic moment, not by a courtroom outburst or a slammed gavel, or even a tearful monologue to a mirror. It happened quietly, like most turning points do, in the middle of a gray afternoon with soft rain tapping against the recovery room windows and the faint smell of instant coffee in the hallway, as I sat with a notepad on my lap and a pen that shook slightly in my still recovering fingers. I wasn't planning revenge just yet, not in the cinematic sense, at least. I was planning reality, the kind that doesn't come with theme music or applause, but with paperwork, calls, and questions no one wants to answer. Because if there was one thing Evan had forgotten in his rush to bury me, it was that I'd lived a long life before he was even born, and I'd learned a thing or two about how to keep records, ask the right questions, and get people to pay attention. The first thing I did was write down everything I knew, every date, every strange moment, every detail that might seem unimportant to someone else, but meant the world to me. I wrote about the night the sleeping pills felt too strong, about Evan's last visit, about the day the card stopped working and the email went dark. I made a list of every institution that had declared me dead, the insurance company, the bank, the government office that filed the certificate. I wrote down names, times, the words people used, because words matter, and I'd learned over the years that even small slips could become cracks in a lie. I didn't know what I was building yet, but I knew it needed to start with a foundation of truth. Next, I asked Alicia, the nurse who'd helped me call Patty, if she could print something for me. She didn't ask why, just smiled and brought me a hospital iPad. I looked up legal aid offices in the area, and after scrolling past the ones that looked too crowded or too expensive, I found a small firm with a quiet website and a simple mission: protecting the forgotten. That felt like enough. I dialed the number, half expecting to be ignored or brushed off. But a calm, older woman answered on the third ring and listened without interrupting as I explained my situation. Not all of it, just enough to get her attention. When I told her my son had filed a false death certificate, she didn't laugh or sound skeptical. She just asked, "And where are you calling from, Mrs. Hill?" I told her the name of the facility. She paused, then said, "Would you be willing to meet someone in person?" I told her I wasn't going anywhere fast, not with staples still healing in my side. She said, "That's all right. We can come to you." 2 days later, a woman named Diane walked into my room wearing a gray cardigan and carrying a leather folder so worn at the corners I could tell she'd been doing this a long time. She was soft-spoken, with short gray hair and eyes that watched everything. She didn't rush me. She sat down in the visitor chair beside my bed, opened a yellow pad, and said, "Start wherever you want." And so I did. I told her everything, slowly, carefully, choking a few times when the words got stuck. But I didn't sugarcoat anything. I told her about the bank, the insurance, the mail, the house. I even told her about the text, and she asked if she could take a photo of it for her file. When I finished, I expected her to look at me with pity or disbelief, or maybe tell me there was little she could do. But instead, she said something that changed everything. "You're not the first." Apparently, fake death claims were more common than people realized, especially when there was money involved and a relative with access. Insurance fraud like this, she said, could lead to prison time, real prison time. The death certificate alone was a felony. The forged notary stamp, the false mailing address, the rerouted accounts, it was enough to build a mountain of charges. The key, she told me, is proving you're who you say you are, not just to me, but to the institutions that buried you. That meant documents. Lots of them. We started gathering whatever I could access. Diane filed requests on my behalf for the death certificate, for the insurance payout documents, for the financial records from the bank. She explained that most companies would hesitate to hand anything over unless I could prove I was still alive. So she asked the facility director to write a signed affidavit confirming my identity and current medical status. We had a staff member witness it. We took photos of me holding my driver's license and my birth certificate, which, thank God, had been scanned into my phone by a social worker months ago when I had applied for Medicare. We also filed something she called an identity reclamation claim with the Social Security Administration, which she said would take time, but was necessary if I ever wanted to unlock my government benefits again. The whole process was complicated, but Diane moved through it like someone who'd done it before. Methodical, precise, but never cold. There was something in her that reminded me of women I used to work with back in the 70s. The kind who held families and offices together without ever getting credit for it. In the middle of all this, something unexpected happened. One of the nurses, an older woman named Brenda, who'd worked in the facility for nearly a decade, knocked gently on my door after dinner and stepped in with a quiet look on her face. She told me she'd overheard part of my conversation with Diane earlier that day. I braced myself, thinking she was going to scold me for discussing legal matters in public. But instead, she closed the door behind her and said, "Something similar happened to my aunt. Her daughter cleaned out her bank account and left her in a state home. People don't talk about it, but it happens more than you'd think." She said if I needed anything, documents, witnesses, proof of medication logs, she would help. She'd seen Evan come in and out those first days after my surgery. She remembered what he said, what he took. She even remembered the night the sleeping pills hit me too hard. "You were out cold," she whispered. I remember thinking that wasn't normal. Brenda became my quiet ally. She gave Diane copies of visitor logs, medication records, even a security footage request form. Everything added up. Evan had been orchestrating this from the moment I checked in. He saw the surgery, the isolation, the lack of oversight, and he struck. But what he didn't count on was that I'd wake up, not just from the medication, but from everything, from years of being too trusting, too quiet, too hopeful that love alone would keep my family whole. Now I had more than grief. I had a case. I'd always believed that when your world falls apart, the only people who will help put the pieces back together are the ones who were already standing close, the ones you raised, the ones you poured your soul into. But as it turns out, sometimes it's the strangers who reach for your hand, the quiet faces in the background who step forward when everyone else steps away, and you don't realize it at first. But those small acts of kindness start to build something sturdier than the trust you once had in the people who let you down. That's how it felt the day Diane introduced me to Miriam. Miriam worked for the insurance company, the very one that had paid out my death benefit. She wasn't someone high up in the chain, just a mid-level account verification officer in their regional office, but she had seen my name before. When Diane reached out to request claim documents and identity verification forms, it was Miriam who noticed the case file looked suspicious. She had handled the initial claim when Evan filed it, and she remembered it because the timeline had felt rushed. The death certificate had been submitted before the hospital had even updated their public discharge records. She told Diane that she had raised a small internal flag at the time, but the system approved the payout anyway. He had everything he needed, she said. It looked clean, until now. Diane asked if Miriam would be willing to meet me. At first, she said no, she couldn't. Company policy, legal risks. But 2 days later, she changed her mind. She drove out to the recovery facility on her day off, wearing jeans and a navy raincoat, and came into my room carrying a pastry box from a local bakery, like we were just two old friends catching up. She was probably in her 50s, with neat, silver-streaked hair and tired but kind eyes, and she shook my hand like it meant something. She sat down, placed the pastry box between us, and said softly, "I'm sorry this happened to you." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. She opened her folder, tapped her fingers nervously for a second, then told me she wasn't supposed to be here, wasn't supposed to talk off the record. But something about my case had stayed with her, and when she saw Diane's name, she remembered a training they'd both attended years ago. "Diane's the kind of woman who doesn't knock on doors unless she's ready to kick them in," she said with a faint smile. "Miriam couldn't give us official documents, but she told me what she remembered. Evan had filed the claim using a notarized death certificate and submitted a letter stating he was the sole beneficiary. The payout had been approved within 5 days, an unusually fast turnaround. He had provided an email address under my name, but it wasn't one they had seen in my file before. He had also signed all required release forms digitally, which meant they never saw a physical signature or heard a voice. "It's a loophole," she said. "Digital systems don't see people. They just see checkboxes." What got to me most was when she pulled out her phone, opened her personal social media app, and showed me something I didn't expect. Evan had posted a public thank you message after the payout. "We miss you every day, Mom," it read. "Your legacy means the world to us. You gave us this fresh start." Below it was a photo of their new home, a 2-story house with a white picket fence, and a caption that read, "Built on love and blessings." Blessings. That word hit me like a slap. Miriam looked at me and said quietly, "He didn't just steal your money. He made you part of the narrative. He used you like a prop." It took everything in me not to cry, but I didn't want to give him that. I just asked her, "Is there a way to undo what he's done?" She hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "but it'll take more than proving you're alive. You'll have to show intent, show that he knew exactly what he was doing, that it wasn't just confusion or poor communication. It has to be deliberate, and it has to be public." I wasn't ready to go public, not yet, but I was getting closer. Miriam said she would quietly alert her supervisor, off the record, and flag the account for internal fraud review. That didn't guarantee anything, but it meant someone in the system would start asking questions. She handed me a handwritten note before she left, a list of the internal claim numbers, the digital ID used to sign the forms, and a private extension I could call if anything urgent came up. She even wrote a little line at the bottom, "Don't let them bury you." After she left, I sat in my bed holding that note like it was a life preserver in an ocean I didn't know I'd been drowning in. Because for the first time since this all began, I didn't feel invisible. Someone on the inside had seen me, not as a case file, not as a ghost, but as a woman who still had a voice, and I planned to use it. There's something strange that happens when you finally decide to stop hiding. You expect to feel brave, or righteous, or even victorious, but what you mostly feel, at least in the beginning, is exposed. It's like stepping out into the world without your coat in the middle of a cold wind. You don't realize how much you've been shielding yourself until you're standing there, raw and open, watching people's eyes slide past you, wondering who sees you as a woman reclaiming her truth and who still sees you as a ghost. But I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was Margaret Hill, 67 years old, legally alive, emotionally bruised, and more determined than I'd ever been in my life. With Diane's help, we put together a package, a physical folder thick with notarized documents, photos, medical records, witness statements, and a personal letter I wrote by hand explaining what had been done to me and what I intended to do about it. It was more than evidence. It was my voice, printed in ink. We mailed one copy to the insurance company's fraud division and hand-delivered another to the local police precinct. And even though Diane told me not to expect too much too quickly, these cases could take weeks or months to process, I still felt like I'd finally taken the first real step out of the grave Evan had tried to bury me in. But fate, as it often does, decided to test my resolve. A few days after submitting the report, I received a call. It was from someone at the insurance office, Miriam's supervisor. He was cold and clinical, and his voice gave nothing away. He said they needed to verify my identity in person and requested that I come to their downtown office for a face-to-face identity audit. I hesitated. The idea of walking into the very building where they had marked me as dead made my skin crawl. But Diane insisted it was a good sign. It meant the internal review had started, so we went. She wheeled me into the building herself, my body still sore, still healing, dressed in my best blouse and soft gray pants, with my hair combed back and my ID clutched tightly in my hand like a passport back into the world. The office was tall, cold, all glass and metal, and polite smiles. They took us to a conference room with mirrored walls, where a man in a dark suit waited with a laptop, a camera, and a thin smile that never touched his eyes. The audit began. Photographs, signature comparisons, voice recordings, questions about my past. I answered everything calmly, even when my hands trembled. Diane sat beside me, her presence like a shield. And then, as they finished scanning my fingerprints, another man walked in through the door, younger, sharper, with a badge clipped to his belt and a phone in his hand. He paused when he saw me, frowned slightly, and said something that made the whole room go silent. "We just received a fraud report from Evan Hill. He's claiming someone is impersonating his deceased mother." For a second, I felt everything stop. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Diane's jaw clenched. The man in the suit turned to me slowly, his expression unreadable, and said, "Ma'am, is there any chance your son doesn't know you're alive?" I felt the blood drain from my face, but I kept my voice steady. "He knows," I said, slowly and clearly. "He knows because he's the one who filed the false claim. He knows because I received a text from him telling me to stay quiet. He knows because he built a new life on my insurance money and cleaned out my home while I was sedated after surgery." The badge-wearing man raised an eyebrow and asked to see the text. I showed him. He read it twice. Then he handed the phone back and stepped out into the hallway, muttering something into his radio. The room stayed still for several long minutes. No one said anything. I stared at the mirrored wall across from me, watching my own reflection. The tired face, the folded hands, the flicker of something that used to be fear, but now looked like fire. He came back in a few moments later and nodded once at the other man. "She stays. Flag his account. Begin a formal case." I exhaled, slowly, like I'd been holding my breath for years. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I had passed the test. The last second twist, the chance that someone might actually believe him over me, had come and gone, and I had stood through it. Not because I had to prove I was strong, but because I refused to be erased again. That night, back in my room, I sat by the window and watched the headlights blur on the road below. Somewhere out there, my son was celebrating another lie, unaware that the foundation under his feet was beginning to crack, and he still didn't know that I had walked into that office alive. He still thought I was a whisper, but soon I'd be a roar. There's something deeply satisfying, in a quiet, almost tragic way, about watching a lie begin to collapse under the weight of truth, especially when that lie was built over your own name, over your body, over the soft parts of your life that someone you once loved chose to bury for a payout. But this wasn't about revenge, not in the cartoonish sense people like to imagine. This was about reclamation. I wasn't trying to destroy my son. I was trying to unmake the version of him that thought I could be thrown away. The first ripple came from the bank. With the case now open at the insurance company and the fraud report filed through Diane's legal network, they finally began unfreezing my financial history. A representative called me directly. No more pre-recorded menus or disconnected lines. And her voice was gentle, careful, like someone trying to speak to a woman who had just crawled out of the grave. She confirmed that my personal accounts had been flagged under a deceased status, closed by a third-party executor, Evan, and that he had transferred nearly $42,000 into a joint fund under his and Jenna's names. There were wire receipts, transfer authorizations, and internal notes about my final estate resolution, all signed digitally with my name, but none of them came from me. "We're correcting it now," the woman said, "but this may take time to unwind." I told her I understood. I was patient. I had waited this long. Next came the mail. Brenda, my quiet ally at the facility, helped me request a physical redirect. Within days, letters began arriving again under my name, bills, statements, a small birthday card from my church that had been delayed for weeks. Among them was a notice from a third-party brokerage, an investment account I had almost forgotten about. Evan had filed to liquidate it 3 days after I was declared dead. He had taken nearly $11,000 out and moved it into a savings account labeled Claire's Future. That part almost made me laugh, not out of humor, but from the absurdity of it. My granddaughter's future, built on her grandmother's fake death. The paper trail was clearer than I ever expected. Digital lies leave fingerprints, and Diane followed them like a bloodhound. She filed new motions, issued subpoenas, and even reached out to a friend in the district attorney's office to fast-track parts of the case. "This is the kind of story they don't like to talk about," she told me one afternoon as we sat in the small sunroom near my recovery ward, "because it's not about strangers, it's about family." And somewhere in that silence, I realized something. Evan didn't think he'd done anything truly wrong. He thought he'd simply taken what was already his, skipping the messy in-between, avoiding the guilt of watching me decline or listening to me ask for help. In his mind, I was an inconvenience he'd simply erased, with a few signatures and a story he could sell to friends and neighbors as noble grief. He didn't see himself as a thief. He saw himself as someone who handled things. But now he would have to explain. It started small. An alert from the insurance company sent to the address on file, a flagged account notification, a request for additional documentation regarding the payout. Then came a knock. At his door, not mine. Someone from internal fraud. Not police, not yet, but enough to rattle the picture frames on the wall. Miriam kept me updated when she could. She said his tone changed in emails, shorter, less confident, more questions, fewer statements. He asked whether the claim was truly under investigation. He asked if they had new information. She didn't answer directly. She let the silence build. Then something strange happened. He posted less. The beach photos stopped. The hashtags about new beginnings vanished. There were no more updates about the dream car or the white picket fence house. In fact, the last thing I saw before he locked his profile was a vague, anxious message. Sometimes life hits back when you least expect it. That night, I poured myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and thought about how many times I had stayed quiet over the years, when he snapped at me in his 20s, when he forgot my birthday, when he lied about just needing a small loan. How often I had told myself he was stressed, overwhelmed, trying his best. But now I saw it clearly. Evan had been practicing this kind of betrayal for years. This was simply the time he decided to cash it in. But I wasn't his mother in a photo anymore. I was alive, and I was coming for everything. There's a moment in every storm when the wind begins to settle, when the sky still hangs low and heavy, but the worst has passed. And what's left behind isn't peace exactly, but clarity. That's what it felt like when the investigator called me to say charges had been formally filed. It wasn't joy. It wasn't vengeance. It was something simpler and older, a deep, steady feeling that justice, long delayed and nearly buried, had finally stretched its limbs and stood up straight. Evan had been arrested for insurance fraud, identity theft, and falsifying legal documents. They didn't put him in handcuffs at his front door like some TV drama. It was quieter than that. He was asked to come in for questioning and didn't come back out. When I first heard the words, "he's in custody," I didn't know how to feel. I waited for that wave of satisfaction, that imagined spark of, he got what he deserved. But instead, all I felt was a long, tired exhale. Like I'd been holding my breath through an entire chapter of my life and finally let it go. I didn't feel victorious. I felt real again. The investigation confirmed everything we already knew. He had used my medical records to forge paperwork, created a fake email to impersonate me, and funneled money into multiple accounts, some in his name, some in Jenna's, and even one under a fake trust supposedly set aside for Claire. They traced the timeline, matched the signatures, cross-referenced hospital records. The truth wasn't just visible, it was undeniable. He tried to deny it at first, claimed it was a misunderstanding, said he thought I was dying and was trying to prepare, said he was just overwhelmed. But the text message to me, the financial transfers, the photos of him celebrating my passing, they told a different story, a complete story. And this time, no one was erasing me from it. Jenna claimed she didn't know. Maybe she didn't. I don't know. I didn't ask. That was no longer my battle. I'd spent too much time in my life making room for people's excuses, trying to soften the blow of what they'd done by imagining better versions of them in my head. I was done doing that. The insurance company reversed the payout. The accounts were frozen, pending restitution. The bank issued a formal apology and reopened my records. I regained access to my Social Security, my investment accounts, my benefits. But more than that, I regained my identity, my name, my voice, my place in the world. When I left the recovery facility 3 weeks later, the sun was warm, and the nurse who wheeled me out handed me a small envelope. a goodbye card signed by the staff. Inside was a folded note from Brenda, written in careful cursive. They forgot you were still here. You reminded them. I moved into a small house just outside the city. Nothing grand, just enough for one person and a garden. I planted tomatoes just like I used to. I bought a rocking chair and a new tea kettle. I rejoined my book club. I took a watercolor class at the community center. I made space for things that had nothing to do with him. Sometimes people ask me if I've spoken to Evan since the arrest. I haven't. And I don't plan to, because forgiveness, I've learned, is not the same as access. I can let go of the pain without inviting it back to dinner. I can mourn the boy I raised without allowing the man he became to sit at my table. I tell this story not for sympathy or drama, but because I know I'm not alone. I've met other women since then, mothers, sisters, grandmothers, who were pushed aside, talked over, counted out, until they stopped counting themselves. But we are not invisible, we are not weak, and we do not disappear quietly. My name is Margaret Hill. I am 67 years old. I am legally and spiritually alive, and I am no one's ghost.